Good morning. It is wonderful to be with you here this morning. We have a couple people staying in the back. My sermons are way too long to stand through, so you might want to come up to the front row. I'm sorry. I apologize in advance, but just want you to know there are seats on the front row. We live by a mantra here at Paradox, which is sermons at Paradox are designed to start discussions and not end them. It's important that I say this at the front because today's sermon is jam-packed full of heresy. And I tell you that because I have to tell you that my goal today is to show you how heresy is actually deeply rooted in the Christian tradition, which if that sounds like a paradox, then welcome. We're glad that you're here with us this morning. Yeah, you can get excited. We got one person clapping. It's catching on slowly. There are other people that are looking at like, this is my first time here and I have no idea what's about to happen. Neither does anyone else. Welcome. Now, last week we talked about biblical contradictions. And a lot of Christians believe that the Bible cannot contain contradictions, right? And the question that we asked last week is where do we get the idea that the Bible can't contain contradictions? And we talked about how the idea that the Bible can't contain any contradictions comes from the doctrine of inerrancy. Can I hear you say inerrancy this morning? Yes, inerrancy means incapable of being wrong. So there are people who believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, which means that it does not have any flaws, and contradictions are flaws that are in the Scriptures. So they push back and they say, no, there are no contradictions in Scripture. What most people don't realize is that this idea of inerrancy is a relatively recent invention in the Bible's history. In fact, we put up a giant timeline last week, and I showed how inerrancy came into being and became a church doctrine in 1881, and that was the first church, the Presbyterian Church was the first church to adopt this as their official doctrine, and all of it was in response to Charles Darwin's publication of The Origins of the Species, which was published in 1859. Now, once that was published, that caused people in New Jersey to freak out at Princeton Theological Seminary, and they came up with the doctrine of inerrancy in 1881. Now, today, the question that I want to ask this morning is, why did Darwin's theory lead to the creation of a doctrine of inerrancy? Now, most Christians can understand why this is because a lot of Christians believe in a literal six-day creation as told in Genesis 1. So let's recap Genesis 1, shall we, and tell the story of creation in the very first chapter of the Bible. We read in Genesis 1:1 some of the most famous words in Scripture. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. And we read about how on the very first day of the earth's existence, God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day and the darkness night. And that was the first day. Then on the second day, God took the waters and separated a space between so that the sky rose above and the waters stayed below in the form of the ocean. And God hallowed that space between where humanity would eventually live their lives out on. And he looked at it and he saw that it was good. And God declared that it was good. That was the second day. Then on the third day, God created rocks, and on those rocks, God placed dirt and soil, and from the soil, God sprang forth trees and flowers and vines and herbs and all sorts of delightful living things, and the planet, for the first time, had life thriving on it. And God looked at this vegetation and said, this is good. And that was the third day. Then on the fourth day, God placed celestial bodies in the sky. God created stars to fill the night sky. God created the sun and the moon and allowed them to orbit and be part of this greater universe. And God looked at these celestial bodies and said, this is good. And that was the fourth day. On the fifth day, God created both animals that flew in the air and also animals that swam in the sea. So God created sharks and whales and osprey and vultures and winged creatures. And God looked at all of these animals flying and swimming and gliding through the air and through the water. And God said, it's good. And that was the fifth day. Then on the sixth day, God created elephants and orangutans and all these other wonderful creatures that inhabited the planet. God created land animals, and God watched them roaming around on the planet and said, this is so good. And before God was done on that sixth day, God in Genesis 1 creates a bunch of men and a bunch of women all at the same time, all in God's image. God creates a multitude of people, and he says, be fruitful and multiply. Go into the world and subdue it. And God says that this day has been good. And so then God, we would assume, is done at this point with creation. But then on the seventh day, God does a trick that none of us saw coming. God creates nothingness. And it is only once God creates the space of the Sabbath that God feels that creation is complete. And upon that creation completion, we read the final words of the creation story in Genesis chapter 2. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And so we ask the question, why did Darwin's theory lead to the creation of the doctrine of inerrancy? Princeton Theological Seminary came along and said, you know why? Because we know with absolute certainty how life came into being on this planet. We know. Don't try to change the way the world came into being, Darwin. We don't want to hear about how environments shaped species. We don't want to hear about natural selection. None of that's in Genesis 1, and we have certainty that this is where the world came from, so don't challenge it, please. Well, this claim may sound well and good, but there's just one problem with this claim, and that problem is the Bible. The Bible challenges or undermines this own claim that Princeton Theological Seminary so proudly championed. Because if you read Genesis 2, verse 4, you read this line that summarizes all of creation and says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. But in that same verse, the creation story takes an unexpected turn. We read in Genesis 2:4, the second half of the verse, in the day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And then in verse 5, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. Now this is rather surprising because after all, we read about herbs and plants being created by God on day 3 in Genesis 1. But as we continue to read Genesis 2, we come to the realization that we're reading a brand new creation story. And this creation story starts in a very different place than Genesis 1. It starts with water and rocks already created on the earth. And Genesis 2 tells the creation story this way. We read about how there was a spring that sprung up and would go out and water the soil around it and then recede. And in that soil, God found mud. And in the mud, God crafted the first human being who, much like the author of Genesis, was a man. God then crafted this first human being and said, you will go into this garden, and God placed this man in the midst of a garden. Now, this is a strange thing to do because remember, the author has told us that there are no trees. So this man is in a plantless garden. But once God places the singular man in the garden, God then causes life to spring up all around him. And the man walks through with wonder as he sees vegetation and all these plants and trees and herbs growing around him. Then God calls the man closer. He calls him back to the mud. And God says, watch this. And from the mud, God crafts not just sea creatures and birds, but sea creatures, birds, and land animals like giraffes and other different creatures. They all come out of the mud at the same time. And God, one by one, asks the man to name them, says, what would you call this? What would you call this? And after naming all of the animals, God causes the man to fall into a sleep. And God then takes a rib from him and creates the crowning achievement of God's creation, which is, of course, woman. Can I get an amen? Yeah, we can get a little more excited than that next time. We'll do this again soon. So once the woman is created, she dwells with the man in the Garden of Eden, and they live a life that is designed and ultimately something that God sees, and God hallows that relationship, and God says all these people should never be alone. So when you look at these stories, we have to do a bit of a review because we start to say, this sounds a little different than Genesis 2. We go back to Genesis 1, which most Christians know. And we read, there is light, space between water and sky, land, plants and trees, sun, moon, and stars. It all fits into 7 nice, neat days as categories. This is where the creation story comes from. But then we get to Genesis 2, and I have met far fewer Christians who know the creation order of Genesis 2 than Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, land and space between exist before God even starts creating. Then we read about how God creates one man, then God creates plants and trees, then all the animals, both in the sea, land, and in the sky, all at the same time. And then God asks Adam to name all of the animals, and then God creates one woman. Now, if you're looking at this and you're saying to yourself, wow, these sure seem different, I will tell you that you are not alone. Because the Bible contains 2 contradictory creation stories. Now, it's here that I know if I'm in most Christian contexts, there is somebody that would stand up and say, no, Craig. This is not a contradiction. Genesis 2 is a retelling of Genesis 1. It's the same story. And to that person who might say that, I want to be very clear. Genesis 2 is not a retelling of Genesis 1. And you may ask me how I know this. And the reason I know this is because I can just imagine walking into a typical Christian church. And I walk into this Christian church and I say, hey, I just want you to know that I believe in a biblical-based idea of creation. Now, this church would be elated. They would say to me, great, that's what we're all about here. What is it exactly that you believe about this biblical idea of creation? And I would say, I would turn to Genesis 2, and you want to know what I believe? I believe that God created a human before all plants and trees. It says it right here in Genesis 2. Now, the church would respond by saying, blasphemy. That's not the correct order. Then I would say, okay, let's see if we can agree on something else. I believe that God created birds, sea life, and land animals all at the same time. There was no day separation between them. Look, right here in Genesis 2. And the church would say, heresy. That's not how creation works. And I would say, okay, I think you have a little more of an emphasis on Genesis 1 than Genesis 2. Let me tell you what I believe. I believe that Adam and Eve were not alone in the Garden of Eden, as it says here in Genesis 1. And they would respond by saying, get behind me, Satan. And when I tell you these things, I point them out because it's really important to acknowledge that all 3 of these are biblical ideas found in Genesis 1 and 2. But these ideas don't fit into the creation narrative that people say occurs when you retell Genesis 2 with Genesis 1. So what we have to be honest about is that the creation story that most of us have heard in church is an arbitrary amalgamation of 2 contradicting creation stories in Genesis. They take most of it from Genesis 1, and they'll add a little sprinkle of Genesis 2, and that's the creation story that we hear in churches today. I tell you this because we have to be honest that the Bible contains 2 contradictory creation stories. Now, at this point, you may have your brain breaking in 2. I can tell you if I was sitting in your seat 10 years ago, I would be freaking out and ask for a paper bag right now. And the reason for that is because this is not the way it's supposed to go. I would start by saying, where did we get 2 creation stories from? It would be so much better if we had 1. So this is going to be a very quick answer to that question because the fact is we don't know. We have a lot of guesses, and there's a lot of academia behind what I'm about to tell you. But there are those who look at a timeline of the Bible and they say, where did the Bible come from? And there are these hypotheses that rally around the idea that the Bible existed first and foremost in oral tradition, which is totally understandable, right? Like you can imagine stories being passed down from generation to generation. And these stories were eventually written down, but after they get passed down in different areas and different geolocations, the stories start to vary slightly. And then with each passing generation, more and more as it goes by. Well, around the time 600 to 300 BCE, which is about as narrow a window as we can get, people started writing these stories down and then putting them together. And what they had was they had a creation story about how God created the world in 6 days. And they had a creation story about how God created the world from mud. And there was somebody who looked at both of these stories and thought, should I put both of these in the book of Genesis? And at some point, someone or some group knowingly put Genesis 1 right next to Genesis 2, knowing the contradiction was there, and they were totally fine with it. It wasn't until much later, closer to the year 2021, that we started to say, they can't contradict each other. As opposed to the person who was putting together Genesis, the book of Genesis, would probably say, why not? It's a better story when they contradict each other. The Bible contains two contradictory creation stories, and we have this idea that we need to find the one that's actually true and discard the other one. But I have found that when we come to biblical contradictions, it's actually better if we allow the contradictions to coexist because there's something beautiful in the tension between them. The Bible is better if we do not resolve this contradiction, but instead look at these contradicting stories and ask them, how are they different and how are they the same? Because when we ask ourselves that question, we put Genesis 1 next to Genesis 2, we realize that maybe certainty isn't the most important thing when it comes to our spiritual relationship with the earth. Instead, there's something else about the earth that is absolutely vital to our spirituality. It's almost like Genesis wants to tell us that it isn't really sure how God created the earth. However, Genesis is entirely sure that creation tells us about God. And it shifts the conversation from a scientific one to a spiritual one. The scientific question is, how old is the earth? Genesis isn't the best at answering that. The spiritual one is, how do we relate and live on this earth? And that's the question Genesis is after. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to you, but allow me to tell you a story that shows you how big of a deal this is, because somebody really believed this, and this person lived about 2,000 years ago. Now, Christians believe that a man named Jesus Christ was both fully human and fully divine. He lived in first century Palestine. He did what he could to fight against economic injustice, and then the people who were in power did not like him, so they had him executed. Now, a few days later, Christians say that he rose from the dead and was resurrected and spoke to his disciples after he rose from the dead. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' last words to his disciples after he has been resurrected from the dead are this. It's called the Great Commission. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. The Gospel of Matthew ends. We then start to read the book of Acts, and we realize that all 11 disciples that heard this from a man who rose from the dead were like, not gonna do it. I'm gonna go speak to the religious people in my own nation because I'm comfortable there. God was so annoyed with this that God was like, fine, I'm gonna get the murdering guy Paul to do what I wanted them to do. So God intervenes in Paul's life and says, I need you to stop killing people, okay? He stops killing people. He's like, okay, now I want you to go to the non-religious folks and I want you to talk to them outside your own nation because this message cannot be contained for one people group. So Paul goes out and he goes to a place called Lystra, which is in modern day Turkey. And when he's there, he all of a sudden comes face to face for the first time with non-religious folks. Now remember that Paul was raised in the system. Paul is as religious as you can get. And he's staring at these people who are probably scaring him half to death. And he's thinking to himself, what do I say? Now, if Paul stole a page from religion's textbook, we would assume that Paul would say, my friends, let me tell you about Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of scriptures that have been written a long time ago. I got you copies of the Bible. I want you to do meticulous Bible study and determine for yourselves that Jesus is the fulfillment of these scriptures so that you may believe. But Paul doesn't do that. Paul's way more creative, innovative, and progressive than all of that. Because here in Lystra, he looks at all of these non-religious folks, and he thinks to himself, how can I tell them about the gospel without using any of the religious language that I've relied on for so long? And he says to these people at Lystra, we bring you good news that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, God allowed all the nations to follow their own ways, yet God has not left God's self without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. He doesn't mention the Bible once. Instead, he says, I want to tell you about God who's been with you the whole time before I ever showed up. God is in the rain that sustains you. God is in the food that feeds your belly and makes life possible. God has been with you not just your entire life, but in your ancestors' lives before you. A few chapters later, Paul is in a place called Athens, which is in modern-day Greece. And when he is there, he is standing in the shadow of this building, the Acropolis, which is 500 years old during Paul's day and age. And he is standing in the shadow of this, and people have brought him together in this city, and they say to him, tell us about this God that you serve. And he says to them, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, the God who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, but instead is contained in the fullness of this world. Paul's most famous epistle in the Bible is the book of Romans. And the book of Romans is fascinating because he's writing a letter to a church. And this church is divided right down the middle. There are the religious folks over here and the non-religious folks over here. And guess what? They can't figure out how to get along. I know, try to imagine, right? So they're coexisting in a church. Paul's trying to resolve this. And when he writes in Romans to the religious people, he quotes scripture like it's nobody's business. He tells them about this passage and this verse and these words and this idea and the history of the Jewish people. And he goes on and on. But then he turns to the non-religious people. And you know how many times he references scripture when he writes to them in the book of Romans? 0. You know what he does talk to them about? The mountains. He says, for what can be known, this is him writing to the non-religious, for what can be known about God is plain to the non-religious because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. His very next words in this passage are, so non-religious folks, you have no excuse because you know God just as well as those people. And don't ever let them tell you that you need the Bible to know who God is because you have creation. Yeah, Paul's pretty progressive, huh? Imagine that Paul was living today and he became a door-to-door evangelist. He wouldn't carry a book with him to sell to anyone. Instead, he'd knock on the door and he'd say, have you heard the good news about Jesus Christ? And these non-religious people would say, like, kind of, but we've never read our Bible. Paul would say, who cares? Have you seen the mountains? And these people would say, yeah, I mean, they're there. We've seen the mountains. And he would respond, then you know God. What else could you possibly need to know? Whether we like it or not, Paul believed that creation is the Bible of the non-religious. That creation is the scriptures of those who have not grown up in church. That creation is the divine testament to who God is for someone who has never identified as religious. And he had no interest in people reading the Bible more. He's like, but have you seen what's around you? That's who God is. And when we talk about this contradiction, there's this idea that the most important question we can answer is, where did we come from? No. The most important thing that we can get our heads around is that we are swimming in a sea of grace that is creation. And creation is the Bible for all humanity. This book, this creation, is not a book relegated to just one religion. Every person who has ever lived before us has lived their lives out within the shadow of these scriptures. And Paul had this idea that yes, the Bible is good, and I'll talk about it to the people in my own religion, and it's got its proper place. But when we talk to everyone, we talk about creation, because that's who God is. My friends, creation is the Bible for all humanity. Now, in response to this, I have some news for you. There's some bad news, and there's also some hopeful news. So let's start with the bad news, shall we? There's some bad news when it comes to creation being the Bible for all humanity, because the bad news is the Bible for all humanity is currently on fire. We don't debate climate change here at Paradox. We very much believe scientists when it comes to this. And if you don't, just one quick graph that shows you what this is. This is the most convincing graph that NASA can give you. If you type in climate change NASA, this will pop up. They're able to check carbon dioxide levels back 800,000 years. And they said it's always kind of stayed right below this line until 1950, when we crossed this threshold that we never seen before. Here in 1950, we all of a sudden had more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere than ever before. Tragically, things have only gotten much worse since 1950. And we are releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a stunning pace that is leading to the planet's destruction. Now, I am part of the Christian tradition. I identify as Christian. And I have been disappointed severely in Christians' response to this. Because most Christians I speak to feel that this is not a pressing issue, that it's not really that important to talk about, that it's not really worth changing our lives about. Now, this may be stunning to you, but I think I know why this is. When your theology revolves around the idea that the world is going to burn when Jesus Christ comes back, then you become frighteningly indifferent when the world begins to burn. There's a real downside to this theology. This idea that the world is a temporary home makes people indifferent toward climate change. And I've talked to a lot of people, I've held this belief myself, that believe this, that the world will burn one day when Jesus comes back. And it's almost like climate change is speeding that up, and people get excited about it. This is a problem, and I would say it's bad news, because the Bible for all humanity is on fire. But there is also hopeful news. And to talk about hopeful news, I want to tell you 3 stories, and these 3 stories revolve around my experience at church school in 3 different capacities. I remember there was one time in the 1st grade when I was sitting at my desk, and I was just like classic teacher's pet. Like, a teacher's approval was the greatest reward that this life had to offer when I was in 1st grade. And I am not ashamed anymore. I remember there was one time I was just sitting at my desk, minding my own business. I had a stack of books on my desk, and my 1st grade teacher walks over to me. She very gently takes the bottom book, which was the Bible, and places it on top of the stack, and then looks at me and says, "We always put the Bible on top here, Craig." To this day, I still have to place the Bible on every stack of books that I have. Yes, I see some people raising hands. We all know that feeling, right? Now, there are some who might dismiss this as superstitious. There are others who might say that this is necessary and a way to properly honor the scriptures, but let's just assume the best about this practice, because I know a lot of Christians who believe this and still practice this to this day. If we assume the best about this practice, it teaches us that Christians ardently protect the surface of the Bible. And it matters what goes on top of the Bible, and we should be concerned with it, which is hopeful news. Which brings us to the 2nd story. I have heard my whole life about how Christians spend at least 15 minutes a day in the Bible. Now, honestly, I've never heard anybody say 15 minutes a day in the books of like Judges, but that's another story for another time. But there's this idea that you will have a greater connection to God if you spend more time in the Bible. And if you don't, you might lose your way and become a very, lost individual, right? Now, let's assume the best intentions about this religious practice. What it tells us is that Christians passionately believe in a deep connection with the Bible, which is hopeful news. Which brings us to the 3rd story. This also takes place in church school, but I was in my master's program. I took a trip to Israel with some incredible teachers, and we got to see the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Dead Sea. And when we were there, we got to see these scrolls, some of the oldest manuscripts of the Bible we have in our possession. And I got to look at them. And I was blown away with humility and also just so excited to be that close to these ancient writings. Now, these writings here, the Dead Sea Scrolls, are encased in a museum. And the museum talks about the people who originally wrote these scrolls. Then the museum talks about who found these scrolls. And then the museum talks about who preserved these scrolls. And on each step of the way, these people were all viewed as heroes by the people who were building this building of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what this teaches us is that Christians enthusiastically celebrate the preservation of the Bible. So when we look at these three different stories, these three stories tell us that there's something about Christians and the way they connect with the Bible, preserve the Bible, and protect the Bible that is really important to us on a very fundamental level, right? And when you look at what these three different ideas come together in, we realize that what it's talking about is that Christians have a real reverence for the Scriptures. This is the hopeful news for me. Christians demonstrate an intense reverence for the printed Bible. We already have that built into our practice. So the question becomes, what if we could start to view the earth differently? My friends, what might happen if Christians, who, may I remind you, there are 2 billion of on the planet right now, what might happen if 2 billion Christians hold the same reverence for the earth that we currently hold for the Bible? That might change something, wouldn't it? And rather than viewing the world as something to burn at the end of time, what if we viewed the earth as the Scripture? And while that may sound like a crazy idea, go back to Genesis 1 and 2. Go back to the story of Paul and tell me that's not at the heart of the tradition. I think that if this came true, we would see a very different reaction when in 2017, the Carbon Majors database released a report trying to pinpoint who was at fault for releasing the majority of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What this report found in 2017 was that of all the greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere, they found that 100 corporations account for 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. 71% belong to 100 companies. But the further up you go the ladder, it even gets more responsible to the people who are at the very top of producing these greenhouse gases. 25 corporations account for 51% of all greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. The report then went to point at the corporations that are the most responsible for carbon dioxide going into the air, and they pointed out these corporations, and they said, these guys are causing severe climate change. Now, I don't know about you, but there is a common thread between all of these companies. They're all in fossil fuels. And what's interesting about this is these folks pay lobbyists to convince you and me that climate change is a partisan issue. We have to dispel the myth that climate change is a partisan issue. Climate change is a human issue, and it should never be drawn across party lines politically. And if you feel like this sermon is too political, I want you to know I understand how you feel. I would have felt the same 10 years ago, but I have to tell you, these guys have told us that we don't talk about these politics in churches like this one, and that's the problem. How different would it be if 2 billion Christians felt that these companies were lighting the Bible on fire? I think they would go crazy, wouldn't they? I think these guys wouldn't stand around for very long at all, would they? And everything would change in a drastic, remarkable way where they would say, these guys are lighting our Bibles on fire, let's stop them. And I think we'd all of a sudden get the urgency that we've been craving with climate change. And when we talk about what creation is much more than just what God did and then left alone. There is a deep tradition within church history that tells us that creation is the first Bible that we received, and the second was the book that we hold in our hands. This is the universal, the ultimate testament of who God is, and it will always transcend religious lines, and Paul knew that on an intuitive level so long ago. He trusted that creation is the first Bible of God. My friends, my wish for you this morning is that we may see creation as the ultimate, universal, and holy Bible for all of humanity. May we preserve, protect, and connect with creation with the same reverence that we hold for the Bible. May our reputation be one of earth's preservation. And may we act with great urgency and boldness as we stand up to corporations, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, that are destroying the scripture of creation. And may we see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, everywhere we go on this planet. Amen.